He taught that everything you've ever seen, touched, or experienced is an illusion. That motion is impossible. That change doesn't exist. And for 2,500 years, no one has successfully proven him wrong. This is the story of Parmenides, the philosopher who claimed reality itself is one eternal, unchanging, indivisible whole, and who built an argument so airtight that it still haunts physicists and mathematicians today. We know almost nothing about him. No portrait survived. His writings exist only in fragments quoted by others. The details of his daily life vanished into the Mediterranean dust. Yet his ideas became so foundational that Plato called him venerable and awesome. And modern scholars argue that Western philosophy essentially split into two camps. Those trying to refute Parmenides and those trying to save him. The man who denied change changed everything. Let's start with what little we can say with confidence. Parmenides was born sometime around 515 BC in Elea, a Greek colony on the southwestern coast of Italy. Picture a small coastal settlement, prosperous from trade, far from the intellectual centres of Athens or Miletus. The town sat on a rocky hillside overlooking the Tyrrhenian Sea, surrounded by olive groves and vineyards. Ships arrived carrying goods and ideas from across the Mediterranean world. This was Magna Graecia, Greater Greece, where colonists had recreated Hellenic culture on foreign soil. His family had money. We know this because poor people didn't become philosophers in ancient Greece. Philosophy required leisure, education, and the freedom to spend years thinking about abstract questions instead of working for survival. Parmenides likely received the standard education of a wealthy Greek youth. Homer memorized, athletics practiced, music studied, rhetoric drilled until persuasive speech became second nature. But here's where it gets interesting. According to later sources, particularly the biographer Diogenes Laertius writing 600 years after Parmenides died, the young man fell under the influence of a Pythagorean named Amenias. This matters more than it might seem. The Pythagoreans weren't just mathematicians obsessed with numbers and geometry. They were a religious community, almost a cult, bound by strict rules about diet, behaviour and secrecy. They believed in reincarnation. They thought reality's deepest structure was mathematical. They practiced ritual purification and sought wisdom through contemplation rather than sensory experience. If Parmenides studied with Pythagoreans, it would explain much about his later philosophy. The distrust of the senses, the emphasis on pure reason, the search for eternal, unchanging truth beneath the chaos of everyday experience. These became his signature moves. Diogenes tells us something else, something stranger. He says Parmenides converted to the quiet life after studying with Amenias. That phrase, the quiet life, meant withdrawal from politics and public affairs to focus on philosophy. It meant rejecting the normal Greek aristocratic path of seeking honour through political leadership and military glory. For a wealthy young man in a Greek city, this was borderline scandalous. You were supposed to serve your polis, lead armies, make speeches in the assembly, win glory for your family name. Parmenides said no to all of it. He chose thought over action. This decision would define not just his life, but the entire Western philosophical tradition. The contemplative life, the life of the mind, the scholar's withdrawal from worldly affairs, it all starts gaining cultural legitimacy here, with figures like Parmenides making it seem noble rather than cowardly. But he didn't completely withdraw. Here's the paradox. The man who rejected political life ended up shaping his city's laws. Multiple ancient sources tell us that Parmenides gave Elea its constitution, its fundamental legal code. The city considered these laws so valuable that every year officials swore an oath to uphold them. Think about that. A philosopher who spent his time proving that change is impossible wrote laws designed to govern a changing society. A thinker who argued that multiplicity is illusion created a legal framework for managing the conflicts of many individuals. We don't know what these laws contained. They're lost completely, but their existence tells us something crucial. Parmenides wasn't an ivory tower mystic divorced from reality. He understood practical governance. He knew how to structure institutions. The same mind that conceived the most abstract metaphysics in Western thought could also draft workable legislation for a functioning city-state. What did Elea look like when Parmenides walked its streets? Archaeological evidence gives us fragments. The city walls were impressive, built from massive stone blocks in the Greek style. An acropolis crowned the hill, dominated by temples whose foundations still exist. The agora, the public square where citizens gathered to argue politics and philosophy, probably wasn't much to look at compared to Athens or Corinth, but it was the centre of civic life. Narrow streets wound between houses built from local stone. The port below handled trade with other Greek colonies and with the indigenous Italian peoples of the interior. The population probably numbered a few thousand at most. Everyone knew everyone. Reputation mattered intensely. When Parmenides walked through town, people recognized him. Some admired his wisdom. Others probably thought he was strange. This wealthy man, who could have pursued normal aristocratic ambitions, but instead spent his time thinking about whether motion exists. And he was building something. Not just ideas, but a school. Parmenides gathered students around him, young men drawn by his reputation for wisdom. The most famous was Zeno, who would become nearly as important to philosophy as his teacher. We'll meet Zeno properly later, but understand that Parmenides wasn't working alone. He was creating an intellectual tradition, a way of approaching questions that his students would carry forward and defend. The school at Elea became known as the Eleatic school, obviously. It would influence Greek thought for generations. But unlike the Pythagoreans with their secret rituals and mysterious doctrines, the Eleatics worked through public argument. They wrote texts meant to be read and debated. They engaged with other philosophers, challenging prevailing views, defending their positions through logic rather than revelation. Parmenides wrote a poem. This sounds almost laughable at first. The man who gave us some of the most rigorous, logical argumentation in philosophy chose to present his ideas in verse. But this was normal for his time. Philosophical prose barely existed yet. If you wanted to present important ideas, you wrote poetry. It made the text easier to memorize and gave it cultural authority. Homer and Hesiod had written in verse. Religious and moral wisdom came in poetic form. So Parmenides wrote hexameter verse, the same meter Homer used for the Iliad. The poem had a title, or at least later scholars gave it one, On Nature. This was generic, almost meaningless. Half the pre-Socratic philosophers wrote works called On Nature. It just meant about the natural world and reality. But Parmenides' poem was unlike anything written before. It opened with an allegory, a mystical journey. The narrator, presumably Parmenides himself, described being carried in a chariot by divine maidens, daughters of the sun, along a road far from the beaten path of mortals. They travelled from night toward light, passing through gates guarded by Justice herself. Beyond the gates sat a goddess, unnamed, who welcomed the traveller and promised to teach him everything, both the unshaken heart of well-rounded truth and the opinions of mortals, in which there is no true trust. Already we see the split that will dominate his philosophy. Truth versus opinion. Reality versus appearance. What reason reveals versus what the senses suggest. The goddess will teach both, but only one path leads to genuine knowledge. Then came the philosophy proper, and it was devastating in its implications. The goddess announced that there are only two possible paths of inquiry. The first, that it is, and that it cannot not be. The second, that it is not and that it must not be. These sound like word games, but they're not. Parmenides was investigating the most basic question possible. What can we say about existence itself? His argument, stripped to its core, went like this. Whatever exists, exists. That sounds trivial, But watch what he does with it. If something exists, it cannot have come from non-existence, because non-existence is nothing, and nothing cannot produce something. So whatever exists must have always existed. It's eternal, without beginning. Can it end? No, because for something to cease existing, it would have to become non-existent. And we've already established that non-existence is impossible to think about coherently. You can't say something becomes nothing, because nothing isn't anything to become. So whatever exists is also imperishable, without end. Can it change? No, because change means becoming something different from what you were. But if you're genuinely different, then what you were has ceased to exist, and what you are now has come into existence. We're back to the problem of things coming from or passing into non-existence. So whatever exists must be unchanging. Can it move? No, because motion requires empty space, void, for something to move into. But void is non-existence, and non-existence doesn't exist. So there's nowhere to move to. Whatever exists must be motionless. Can it be divided? No, because division requires that there be parts, and parts require boundaries between them, and boundaries require something that separates one part from another. But what could do the separating? Either something that exists or something that doesn't. If it exists, it's not really a separation, but just more existing stuff. If it doesn't exist, it's void, and we've already ruled that out. So whatever exists must be indivisible, continuous, whole. The conclusion was inescapable, at least within Parmenides' logic. Reality is one eternal, unchanging, motionless, indivisible whole. Everything else, all the apparent motion and change and multiplicity we experience, is illusion, confusion, the unreliable testimony of the senses, misinterpreted by mortals who don't think clearly. This is where Parmenides earned his reputation as philosophy's most radical skeptic about everyday experience. He wasn't saying the world looks strange, he was saying the world, as it appears, doesn't exist at all. You think you see change? Illusion. You think objects move? Impossible. You think there are many things? Wrong. There's only one thing. You think you were born and will die? Neither birth nor death are real. The sheer audacity of this position cannot be overstated. Imagine standing in front of students and telling them that despite appearances, nothing has ever moved, nothing has ever changed, nothing has ever come into or gone out of existence. Imagine the objections. But I just walked across the room. But I was a child, and now I'm grown. But I see many different objects. Parmenides had to face all of this. His response was essentially, your senses deceive you. Reason alone reveals truth. This set up the fundamental tension in Western philosophy, the war between rationalism and empiricism that wouldn't be resolved for 2,000 years. Can we trust reason alone to tell us about reality, or must we start from sensory experience? Parmenides chose reason and followed it to conclusions that violated every intuition humans possess. The second part of his poem, the part describing the opinions of mortals, presented a cosmology, a picture of how the world appears to work even though that appearance is ultimately false. He described the cosmos organized in rings, some of fire, some of darkness, some mixed. He talked about the heavens, the moon, the sun, but he framed all of this as mere opinion, the beliefs of people who trust their senses instead of reason. Scholars argue endlessly about why he included this section. Was he showing that even within the realm of appearance, some accounts are better than others? Was he demonstrating his ability to do conventional cosmology before rejecting it? Was he acknowledging that even if ultimate reality is one unchanging whole, we still need to navigate the world of appearances? We don't know. The text is fragmentary, and Parmenides didn't leave us a commentary explaining his intentions. What survived of the poem comes to us through quotations in later authors. Simplicius, a philosopher writing 1,000 years after Parmenides, preserved the largest chunks because he was commenting on Aristotle, who had discussed Parmenides extensively. Plato quoted him. Sextus Empiricus quoted him. We piece together what Parmenides wrote from these scattered references, like reconstructing a shattered vase from pieces found in different archaeological sites. The fragments we have suggest the complete poem was substantial, probably several hundred lines at least, maybe more. But we possess perhaps 20% of it, maybe less. Imagine trying to understand someone's entire philosophical system from a fifth of their work, and you'll understand the challenge facing scholars of Parmenides. What we do have is enough to see the revolutionary nature of his thought. Before Parmenides, Greek philosophers had focused on explaining the natural world. What's the basic substance of reality? Water, said Thales. Air, said Anaximenes. Fire, said Heraclitus. They disagreed about content but shared an approach. Observe nature, identify patterns, propose underlying principles. Parmenides changed the game. He didn't start from observation. He started from logic, from what must be true simply by thinking clearly about existence itself. This shift from empirical investigation to logical analysis marked the birth of metaphysics as a distinct philosophical discipline. After Parmenides, you couldn't just propose a theory about nature. You had to defend it against his arguments about what's logically possible for anything to exist at all. His influence on Plato was profound and explicit. In the dialogue Parmenides, written when Plato was probably in his 60s, the character of Socrates is portrayed as a young man meeting the aged Parmenides and his student Zeno. The dialogue shows Parmenides dismantling some of Socrates' early philosophical positions with devastating logical precision. Whether this meeting actually happened historically is doubtful, but Plato's choice to present Parmenides as the elder statesman capable of intellectually dominating even Socrates tells us how seriously Plato took his predecessors' arguments. The Eleatic school's influence extended beyond Plato. Aristotle devoted significant space in his metaphysics to explaining where Parmenides went wrong, which itself shows that Aristotle couldn't simply dismiss him. The Stoics engaged with Eleatic arguments. Medieval philosophers debated them. Modern logicians and metaphysicians still find themselves grappling with versions of Parmenidean puzzles about existence, non-existence, and change. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. We've established the philosophical content, but what about the man behind it? Who was Parmenides as a person, walking the streets of Elea, talking with students, living his daily life? The honest answer is, we have almost no idea. The biographical tradition is thin and probably unreliable, but from the fragments and the context, we can sketch possibilities, imagine the world he inhabited, understand the forces that shaped his thought. Elea itself provides our first clue. The city sat on the western coast of what's now southern Italy, in a region the Greeks called Magna Graecia, Greater Greece. This wasn't mainland Greece, but a colonial frontier, settled by Greeks fleeing political upheaval and seeking economic opportunity. Elea was founded around 540 BC by refugees from Phocaea, a Greek city in Asia Minor that had fallen to Persian conquest. These weren't philosophical theorists establishing an ideal community. They were displaced people building a new home in unfamiliar territory. The location mattered. Colonial cities operated differently from established Greek centres like Athens or Sparta. They were newer, less bound by ancient traditions, more open to innovation. The social hierarchies weren't as ossified. A clever person from modest origins might rise to prominence through intellectual achievement rather than noble birth. This environment proved fertile ground for philosophy. Some of the most innovative early Greek thinkers came from these colonial cities. Pythagoras worked in Croton, not far from Elea. Empedocles came from Acragas in Sicily. Zeno and Melissus, Parmenides' students and defenders, also flourished in this Western Greek context. Parmenides probably lived from roughly 515 to 450 BC, though these dates are educated guesses. Ancient sources disagree wildly about chronology. Plato's dialogue suggests Parmenides was about 65 when he visited Athens and met a very young Socrates, which would place that meeting around 450 BC, if it happened at all. Working backwards, that gives us the approximate dates. But Plato might have invented or adjusted the timeline for dramatic purposes, so even this is uncertain. What did Parmenides do besides philosophize? We have one intriguing detail. Ancient sources report that he was a lawgiver for Elea, that he helped establish the city's legal code. This rings true. In Greek colonies, prominent citizens often performed such civic functions. Law-giving wasn't a specialized profession, but a responsibility of respected community members. If accurate, this detail tells us something important. Parmenides wasn't a withdrawn hermit contemplating pure abstractions in isolation. He was engaged with practical governance, thinking about how communities should organize themselves, what rules should govern human interaction. There's a tension here worth noting. The philosopher who argued that change is impossible, that motion is illusory, that the world of appearances is fundamentally unreal, also participated in creating laws to regulate that world of appearances. How do we reconcile this? Perhaps the same way we reconcile the poem's two sections. Even if ultimate reality is unchanging being, we still live in a world of apparent change. And that world needs organizing. The laws don't describe metaphysical truth, but they serve human needs within the realm of mortal opinion. Or perhaps Parmenides' philosophy developed over time. Maybe he was a lawgiver in his youth, a practical-minded citizen contributing to his community, and only later developed his radical metaphysical views. We don't know when he wrote his poem. Was it the product of a young revolutionary thinker or an older man's mature reflection? The ancient sources don't tell us, and the poem itself provides no definite clues. The tradition also connects Parmenides to Pythagorean philosophy. Some sources claim he was a student of Xenophanes, a wandering poet-philosopher who criticized anthropomorphic conceptions of the gods and suggested that if horses and oxen could draw, they'd depict gods as horses and oxen. Other sources mention a Pythagorean named Amenias, who influenced Parmenides' turn toward philosophy. These connections are plausible. Pythagoreanism was strong in southern Italy during this period. The Pythagorean emphasis on mathematics and logical demonstration might have influenced Parmenides' approach to philosophical argument. But we need to be careful. Ancient biographers loved creating teacher-student lineages, connecting all the philosophers into neat family trees of intellectual influence. Sometimes these connections were genuine, sometimes they were speculation or invention. With Parmenides, we simply don't have enough reliable information to know for certain who taught him or how he arrived at his distinctive views. What we can say with confidence is that Parmenides founded a school. Zeno of Elea was his student, and according to some ancient sources, his beloved companion. Whether their relationship was romantic or simply deeply devoted friendship, we can't determine, and probably shouldn't speculate. What matters philosophically is that Zeno dedicated his intellectual career to defending Parmenides' views against critics. Zeno's famous paradoxes, the paradoxes of motion that still puzzle philosophy students today, were designed as weapons in this defense. Critics said Parmenides' position was absurd because obviously motion exists. Zeno responded with arguments purporting to show that the belief in motion leads to equal or greater absurdities. His most famous paradox, Achilles and the tortoise, goes like this. Achilles races a tortoise. The tortoise gets a head start. Before Achilles can pass the tortoise, he must reach where the tortoise started. But by the time he gets there, the tortoise has moved ahead. Before Achilles can reach that new position, the tortoise moves again. This continues infinitely. Therefore, Achilles can never pass the tortoise. Obviously, This conclusion is false. Fast runners do overtake slow ones. But the puzzle reveals something interesting about infinity and motion. Zeno wasn't trying to prove that motion doesn't occur. He was showing that believing in motion creates logical difficulties just as serious as denying it. If you're going to reject Parmenides because his view seems counterintuitive, you'd better explain how your alternative avoids these problems. Melissus of Samos, the other major Eleatic after Parmenides and Zeno, extended the arguments further. He emphasized that being must be infinite in extent, not just eternal in duration. His reasoning, if being had limits, what would lie beyond those limits? More being, then the limits weren't real. Nothing. But nothing cannot exist, so there's no boundary where being stops and nothing begins. Therefore, being extends infinitely in all directions. These arguments show the Eleatic school working out the implications of Parmenides' starting point. They weren't just repeating the master's words, they were developing his philosophical program, defending it against critics, extending its logic into new areas. The relationship between teacher and devoted students raises another question. Was Parmenides a charismatic figure? Did he inspire personal loyalty through force of personality, or purely through the power of his arguments? We have no way to know. The fragments give us access to his reasoning, but not to his personal manner. Was he warm and encouraging, cold and severe, witty, humorless? The text provides no answers. What the text does provide is a remarkable confidence in reason's power. Parmenides believed that through pure thought, without any empirical investigation, we could arrive at necessary truths about reality. This is rationalism in its most extreme form. Not just that reason is important or useful, but that it's sufficient by itself to understand the fundamental nature of existence. This confidence might seem strange to modern readers, raised in an age of empirical science. We're accustomed to the idea that you learn about reality by observing it, by conducting experiments, by checking your theories against evidence. The notion that you could determine the nature of reality while sitting in a chair thinking seems not just wrong, but absurd. Yet Parmenides had a point. Consider mathematical truth. We don't discover that 2 + 2 = 4 by repeatedly putting two objects next to two objects and counting them. We understand it through pure reason. Once you understand what 2 means, what plus means, what 4 means, you see that the equation must be true. No amount of empirical observation could make it more certain. If you found what seemed to be a case where 2 + 2 = 5, you'd conclude you'd miscounted or misunderstood something, not that arithmetic had failed. Parmenides thought metaphysical truths worked similarly. Once you really understand what it means for something to be, you see that certain things must be true and others must be false, regardless of how things appear to our senses. The appearances might deceive us, our senses might mislead us, but reason properly employed cannot err. This raises a question that would haunt philosophy for centuries. When reason and experience conflict, which should we trust? Parmenides sided firmly with reason. If logical argument proves that change is impossible, but our eyes show us things changing, then our eyes are lying. The senses belong to the realm of mortal opinion, unreliable and deceptive. Only reason accesses truth. Most later philosophers rejected this extreme rationalism. Aristotle argued that we need to trust our senses, that a philosophy leading to conclusions radically at odds with obvious experience has gone wrong somewhere. The empiricist tradition, culminating in figures like David Hume, insisted that all knowledge ultimately derives from sensory experience, and that pure reason alone tells us nothing about the world. But Parmenides' challenge didn't disappear. Even philosophers who rejected his conclusions had to grapple with his arguments. You can't just dismiss logic because its conclusions seem weird. You have to show where the reasoning goes wrong, and that proved surprisingly difficult. Modern physics adds an interesting twist. relativity theory and quantum mechanics have revealed that reality, at fundamental levels, behaves nothing like our everyday experience suggests. Space and time aren't what they seem. Matter isn't solid. Causation gets murky. The universe at the quantum level is stranger than anything Parmenides imagined. Not in the specific ways he proposed, but in its divergence from common sense. Does this vindicate Parmenides? Not exactly. He wasn't right about the details. Being doesn't actually work the way he described. But his methodological insight stands. Reason can reveal truths that contradict appearance. Our intuitions about reality, shaped by evolution to help us survive in a middle-sized world of medium speed, don't necessarily map onto fundamental truth. Sometimes you need to follow the logic, even when it leads somewhere counterintuitive. The goddess in Parmenides' poem embodies this idea. She represents reason itself, or perhaps truth, or the impersonal structure of logical necessity. She's not a person with desires and preferences, but a personification of something abstract. When she speaks, she's not offering opinions or preferences. She's revealing what must be the case. This notion of truth as something objective, independent of human wishes or cultural context, was itself relatively new in Parmenides' time. Earlier Greek poets presented truth as something the muses granted, a kind of divine gift. You couldn't reason your way to truth. You had to be inspired, possessed by divine power. The poets spoke truth because a god spoke through them. Parmenides kept the imagery of divine revelation, but transformed its meaning. The goddess reveals truth not through mystical inspiration, but through logical demonstration. The journey to her realm is allegorical. The real journey is intellectual, the movement from confused thinking to clear reasoning. Anyone can make this journey by learning to think properly. You don't need the muse's favour or divine possession. You need logic. This democratization of truth-seeking mattered enormously. If truth comes from divine inspiration, then only specially chosen individuals can access it, and the rest of us must accept their authority. But if truth comes from reason, then anyone capable of following an argument can discover it for themselves. The philosopher replaces the prophet, yet there's an elitism here too. Parmenides divides humanity into two groups, those who follow the path of truth and those trapped in the way of mortal opinion. Most people, he suggests, stumble through life in confusion, accepting appearances uncritically, never thinking carefully about reality's nature. Only the few who learn to reason properly escape this condition. This tension between philosophy's democratic and elitist aspects would persist throughout its history. On one hand, philosophy claims that truth is accessible to anyone through reason, that no special revelation or authority is required. On the other hand, philosophers have often suggested that most people are too lazy, too confused, or too corrupted by bad education to think clearly. The masses remain trapped in opinion while the philosopher ascends to truth. Parmenides gave this tension its earliest clear expression. The path of truth is open to all, but few choose to walk it. Most mortals wander in confusion, and that's partly their own fault for not thinking carefully enough. But it's also the fault of their senses, which naturally deceive them, and of language itself, which encodes the confused assumptions of ordinary experience. The radicalism of Parmenides created an immediate crisis. If his logic was sound, and many found it disturbingly compelling, then explaining the world we actually experience became suddenly impossible. You couldn't just dismiss him. His arguments had teeth. But you also couldn't accept his conclusions and continue doing philosophy in any meaningful sense. What would there be left to investigate if change, plurality, and motion were all illusions? This crisis forced Greek philosophy into its most creative period. Thinkers after Parmenides had to find ways around his arguments while respecting their logical force. You couldn't simply ignore him and go back to the old ways of thinking. He'd shown that common sense contained contradictions. Any new philosophy would need to address those contradictions head-on. The responses divided into roughly two camps. Some accepted Parmenides' basic insight, but tried to modify it in ways that made room for the changing world we observe. Others rejected his premises while trying to preserve what was valuable in his method. Both approaches produced fascinating results. Among those who accepted the Parmenidean framework but sought to soften it, Empedocles stands out. He was a curious figure, part philosopher, part mystic, part showman. Ancient sources describe him wandering through Sicily in purple robes and golden sandals, claiming to be an immortal god. He allegedly threw himself into Mount Etna to prove his divinity, though the volcano supposedly revealed the fraud by spitting out one of his bronze sandals. Whether these stories are true hardly matters. What matters is his philosophical solution to the Parmenidean problem. Empedocles proposed that Parmenides was right about being in a limited sense. There are indeed things that cannot come from nothing or pass into nothing, but there are multiple such things, not just one. He identified four fundamental elements: earth, air, fire, and water. These elements are eternal and unchangeable in themselves. They cannot be created or destroyed. In that sense, they satisfy Parmenides' requirements for genuine being, but these elements can mix and separate in different proportions. When they combine, they create the various substances we observe in the world. What we call generation is really mixture. What we call destruction is really separation. The elements themselves persist through all changes. A tree grows not because something comes from nothing, but because earth, air, fire, and water arrange themselves in a particular pattern. The tree dies not because something becomes nothing, but because that pattern dissolves and the elements return to other combinations. This was clever. Empedocles preserved Parmenides' basic principle that nothing comes from nothing while explaining the apparent changes we observe. Change is real in a sense. The arrangements of elements genuinely differ from one moment to the next. But underlying these surface changes, the fundamental reality remains constant. The elements endure. Being is permanent. He added two forces to explain why elements mix and separate. Love causes different elements to combine into unified wholes. Strife drives them apart into separate masses. These forces aren't physical substances, but principles of attraction and repulsion operating throughout the cosmos. The history of the universe cycles through periods dominated by love, when everything merges into a unified sphere, and periods dominated by strife, when everything separates into distinct elemental masses. Our world exists in the intermediate phases when love and strife are balanced, allowing for the rich variety of mixed substances. Anaxagoras took a different approach, though one still working within Parmenidean constraints. He was an older contemporary of Empedocles and the first philosopher to teach in Athens, bringing Ionian speculation to what would become philosophy's intellectual capital. His solution was more radical than Empedocles' four elements. Anaxagoras proposed that there are infinitely many kinds of fundamental substances, not just four elements, but countless basic stuffs, each eternal and unchangeable. Every substance we observe, hair, flesh, bone, wood, gold, contains portions of all these fundamental stuffs mixed in different ratios. What makes something flesh rather than bone isn't that it contains different fundamental substances, but that the flesh stuff predominates in flesh, while the bone stuff predominates in bone. This sounds bizarre until you see what problem it solves. How can bread become flesh? If Parmenides is right, and nothing can come from what it is not, then flesh cannot arise from non-flesh. Anaxagoras' answer: bread already contains flesh stuff mixed with all the other stuffs. When you eat bread, your body doesn't create flesh from non-flesh. It separates out and rearranges the flesh stuff that was already present in the bread. Everything is in everything, as he famously put it. He added one more crucial element. Something must cause these mixtures and separations. The fundamental stuffs won't rearrange themselves. Anaxagoras posited nous, usually translated as mind or intelligence, as the organizing principle. Nu is the only thing not mixed with everything else. It remains pure and separate, which allows it to govern the mixtures of other things. It initiated the cosmic rotation that separated the original mixture into distinct objects and continues to guide processes throughout the universe. This nous represents an important development. Earlier Ionian philosophers explained everything through material interactions. Water condensed and rarefied. Air thickened and thinned. The universe operated through mechanical processes. Anaxagoras introduced an explicitly non-material organizing principle. Mind governs matter, but isn't itself material. This distinction between mind and matter, between the organizing intelligence and the stuff it organizes, would become central to later philosophy. The atomists Leucippus and his student Democritus offered the most radical solution to the Parmenidean crisis. They accepted his logic almost entirely, but drew opposite conclusions about plurality and void. Yes, Parmenides was right that what is cannot come from what is not. But void, the atomists argued, is what is not, and it exists. The existence of nothing is possible. More than possible, it's necessary to explain motion and change. Imagine reality as composed of infinite atoms moving through infinite void. Atoms are tiny, indivisible particles of being. Each atom is completely solid, containing no void within itself. In this sense, each atom is exactly what Parmenides described: unchanging, indivisible, eternal being. But atoms differ in size and shape. Some are round, some hooked, some concave, some convex. These differences in atomic shapes explain the properties of larger objects. Sweet things are composed of round atoms that roll smoothly over the tongue. Bitter things contain sharp, angular atoms that prick the taste buds. Iron is hard because its atoms are tightly interlocked. Water flows because its atoms are smooth and slippery. The void between atoms makes motion possible. Parmenides argued that motion requires empty space. An empty space cannot exist. The atomists simply denied the second premise. Void exists. It's the nothing that allows something to move. Without void, everything would be packed solid, and motion would indeed be impossible. But with void, atoms can rearrange themselves in infinitely many combinations, creating all the variety we observe. This was materialism in its purest form. Everything that exists is either atoms or void. No gods, no purposes, no mind-organizing matter according to plans. Just atoms moving through space according to mechanical necessity. The universe operates like an infinitely complex machine, all its phenomena arising from the size, shape, and motion of its smallest parts. Even the soul, even thought itself, consists of especially fine, mobile atoms. When you die, these soul atoms disperse and consciousness simply ends. There's no afterlife, no judgment, no cosmic purpose. There's only atoms and void acting according to their nature. The atomist's universe is beautiful in its starkness. Everything reduces to simple principles. Every phenomenon, no matter how complex, results from atomic arrangements. Understanding the world means understanding how atoms combine and separate. This reductionist vision, this confidence that complex wholes can be fully explained by their simplest parts, would dominate scientific thinking 2,000 years later. Modern chemistry's periodic table, physics' standard model, biology's molecular genetics, all descend from the atomist's fundamental insight. The universe is particles in motion. Everything else is just details. But the atomists paid a price for their elegant materialism. If everything happens through mechanical necessity, what becomes of human freedom? If atoms move according to fixed laws, and human beings are just especially complex arrangements of atoms, then every thought and action is determined by prior causes stretching back to the beginning of time. You're not really choosing anything. You're just atoms doing what atoms must do. Democritus bit this bullet. Freedom is an illusion, he suggested. We think we choose, but really we're just dancing to the tune of atomic necessity. This determinism troubled many ancient thinkers, and troubles many still. It seems to conflict with our immediate experience of deliberation and choice. When you decide whether to continue reading or take a break, it feels like a genuine decision, not like atoms mindlessly following predetermined paths. The atomist would say that feeling is misleading. It's how determinism feels from the inside. You're not really deciding, you're just experiencing the result of atomic interactions that were set in motion billions of years ago. Yet there's something odd about this position. If it's true, then the atomists themselves didn't choose to believe it. They were just determined by their atomic constitution to believe it. And if they're determined to believe it, why should we find that belief convincing? Determination doesn't track truth. Atoms might determine someone to believe falsehoods just as easily as truths. This problem, whether determinism undermines its own rational credentials, remains controversial. The atomists also struggled to explain knowledge. If everything is atoms and void, then seeing is just atoms from the object striking atoms in my eye. Thinking is just atoms in my brain rearranging themselves. But why should these atomic processes give me accurate information about the world? Democritus recognized this problem. He distinguished between legitimate knowledge, gained through reason, and bastard knowledge, gained through the senses. The senses show us sweet and bitter, hot and cold, colour and sound. But these qualities don't really exist. They're just how atomic arrangements affect our sense organs. By convention sweet, by convention bitter, he wrote, but in reality, atoms and void. Reason can grasp this truth, even though the senses cannot. But this solution creates a new problem. If the senses deceive us about everything, how did we ever discover the truth about atoms and void? We can't observe atoms. They're too small. We can't observe void. It's nothing. Everything we know about atomic theory must be inferred from sense experience. But if sense experience is fundamentally deceptive, how can inferences based on it be reliable? Democritus never satisfactorily answered this objection. The tension between atomism's reliance on sense experience and its dismissal of sensory qualities remained. These post-Parmenidean systems, for all their ingenuity, shared a common assumption. They all treated Parmenides' challenge as fundamentally a problem about the physical world. How do we explain change in material things while respecting logical constraints? How do we account for plurality and motion without violating the principle that nothing comes from nothing? They sought physical solutions, multiple elements, infinite seeds, atoms and void. But someone was about to suggest that they'd misunderstood the problem entirely. The real issue wasn't physics, it was language, knowledge, and the human condition. The crisis Parmenides created wasn't about how the world works. It was about how we can know anything at all, and whether the pursuit of truth is even possible. That someone, arriving in Athens just as philosophy threatened to lose itself in cosmological speculation, would redirect everything. He would insist that the most important questions aren't about the cosmos, but about how to live. He would claim to know nothing, but would question everything. He would write nothing, but would be remembered forever. His name was Socrates, and he would transform philosophy from a study of nature into an examination of the soul. But before we meet him, we need to understand the intellectual chaos he inherited and why Athens, in the middle of the 5th century, was ready for something completely different. The old cosmological systems had reached a dead end. They'd answered Parmenides by making reality so complex or so counterintuitive that ordinary people couldn't follow the arguments. Philosophy was becoming a specialist's game, played by a few brilliant minds who disagreed with each other about everything. Meanwhile, Athens was changing in ways that made these abstract speculations seem increasingly irrelevant. The city was growing powerful, democratic, and confident. Citizens needed to speak persuasively in assemblies and law courts. They needed practical wisdom about politics and ethics. They didn't need theories about atoms or elements, or the nous organizing the cosmos. Into this gap stepped a new kind of thinker, and they had something to sell. The sophists arrived in Athens during the city's golden age, and they promised something revolutionary. Not truth about the cosmos, but success in life. They were traveling teachers who moved from city to city, offering instruction for a fee. This alone was scandalous. Traditional Greek education was informal, passed down through aristocratic families. The idea of paying for wisdom seemed crass, commercial, almost insulting to the dignity of knowledge itself. But the sophists didn't care about dignity. They cared about results. Their most famous representative was Protagoras, who came to Athens around 450 BC and became spectacularly successful. His teaching focused on rhetoric, the art of persuasive speaking. In a democracy where political decisions were made by citizen assemblies, where legal cases were argued before juries of ordinary people, the ability to speak convincingly was power itself. Protagoras promised to make his students formidable speakers. He charged enormous fees and attracted the sons of wealthy families who saw education as an investment in their political futures. His most famous saying captured the sophistic worldview perfectly. Man is the measure of all things, of things that they are, and of things that are not that they are not. This sounds cryptic, but the meaning is clear. There is no objective truth independent of human judgment. What seems true to you is true for you. What seems true to me is true for me. If we disagree, neither of us is wrong. We simply have different perspectives, different measures. The wind might feel cold to you and warm to me. Both experiences are equally valid. There's no fact of the matter about the wind's temperature beyond how it affects different observers. This wasn't just a theory about temperature. Protagoras applied it to everything, including ethics and justice. What a society considers just is just for that society. What another society considers just is just for them. There are no universal moral truths, only local conventions that vary from place to place. The implications were staggering. If man is the measure, then persuasion matters more than truth. In a law court, it doesn't matter what really happened. What matters is what you can convince the jury happened. In a political debate, it doesn't matter what policy is actually best. What matters is what you can convince the assembly is best. The skilled speaker doesn't need to be right. He needs to be convincing. Protagoras taught techniques for making the weaker argument appear stronger. He showed students how to argue both sides of any question with equal force. This wasn't dishonesty, in his view. It was recognizing reality. Since there's no objective truth, all positions are equally defensible. The goal isn't discovering truth, but winning the argument. Another prominent sophist, Gorgias, pushed these ideas even further. He was famous for a deliberately paradoxical treatise titled On Non-Being, or On Nature. In it, he argued three outrageous claims. Nothing exists. Even if something existed, we couldn't know it. Even if we could know it, we couldn't communicate that knowledge to anyone else. Each claim was defended with elaborate arguments that parodied the style of Parmenides and the earlier philosophers. The first argument showed that both being and non-being lead to logical contradictions. The second argued that knowledge requires a connection between mind and reality that cannot be established. The third demonstrated that language cannot accurately represent thoughts or things. Was Gorgias serious? Probably not entirely. The treatise reads like a philosophical joke, a demonstration of rhetoric's power to prove anything. But the joke had a point. If the great philosophers couldn't agree about fundamental reality, if each new system contradicted the previous one, maybe the whole enterprise of seeking objective truth was misguided. Maybe we should focus on practical persuasion instead. Other sophists explored the implications more directly. Thrasymachus, who appears in Plato's Republic, reportedly taught that justice is nothing but the advantage of the stronger. Moral rules are created by whoever holds power to serve their own interests. The strong make laws that benefit themselves and call obedience to these laws justice. The weak comply because they lack the power to do otherwise. There's no genuine moral obligation, only the appearance of it maintained by force and convention. This was philosophical dynamite in a democratic society. If Thrasymachus was right, then Athens' entire political culture, its emphasis on law and citizen participation and public deliberation, was just a mask for power relations. The eloquent speakers in the assembly weren't seeking truth or justice. They were advancing their interests through manipulation. The sophists claimed to be merely describing reality as it is. They were teachers of practical wisdom, helping young men navigate a world without fixed truths or absolute values. But critics saw something darker. They saw moral relativism that could justify any action. They saw the erosion of traditional values. They saw cynicism masquerading as sophistication. The tension reached a breaking point. On one side stood the sophists with their relativism, their focus on success over truth, their willingness to teach anyone who could pay. On the other side stood traditional Greek culture, with its unexamined assumptions about virtue, honor, and the gods. The sophists had exposed the contradictions in traditional morality. They'd shown that different societies have different values, that moral rules serve the interest of those who create them. That persuasion often matters more than truth. But they'd offered nothing to replace what they destroyed. If everything is relative, if might makes right, if there's no truth beyond individual perspective, then what prevents society from descending into chaos? What stops the strong from simply taking whatever they want? Why should anyone care about justice or virtue or the common good? Athens needed someone who could respond to the sophists without retreating into naive traditionalism. Someone who could acknowledge their insights about the complexity of knowledge and morality while still defending the possibility of wisdom and virtue. Someone who could question assumptions as ruthlessly as any sophist, but in service of finding truth rather than winning arguments. That person was already walking the streets of Athens, though few recognized his importance yet. He didn't charge fees, he didn't claim to teach anything. He dressed simply, went barefoot, and spent his days in the agora engaging anyone who would talk with him in strange conversations that went nowhere and everywhere simultaneously. He asked questions that seemed simple, but proved impossible to answer. He claimed to know nothing, but somehow left his conversation partners feeling that they knew even less. His name was Socrates, and he was about to redirect the entire course of Western philosophy. But understanding Socrates requires understanding the man himself, not just his ideas. And that's surprisingly difficult because Socrates never wrote anything. Everything we know about him comes from others, primarily his student Plato, whose writings are so brilliant that it's hard to separate the historical Socrates from Plato's literary creation. What we can say with confidence is this: Socrates was born in Athens around 470 BC. His father was a stonemason, his mother a midwife. He served as a hoplite, a heavily armed foot soldier, in several military campaigns and showed remarkable courage under fire. He married a woman named Xanthippe, who gained a reputation, deserved or not, for being difficult. They had 3 sons. He was famously ugly, with a snub nose, bulging eyes and a potbelly. He walked around Athens barefoot and poorly dressed, engaging anyone he met in philosophical conversation. His method was distinctive. He didn't lecture or teach in any conventional sense. He asked questions. He claimed to be ignorant, seeking to learn from others who seemed to know what they were talking about. He'd approach someone with a reputation for expertise, a general, a politician, a priest, a craftsman, and ask them to explain their field. What is courage? What is piety? What is justice? The experts would offer a definition. Then Socrates would ask clarifying questions, probing the definition, looking for counterexamples, revealing contradictions and ambiguities the expert hadn't noticed. The conversations typically ended with the expert in a state of confusion, unable to defend their original definition, aware that they didn't understand their own expertise as well as they'd thought. Socrates would claim that at least they'd made progress. They'd moved from false certainty to honest recognition of their ignorance. This was supposed to be helpful, but many people found it infuriating. The method had a name, elenchus, meaning examination or refutation. It worked by exposing contradictions in someone's beliefs. If you claim to know what justice is, Socrates will show you that your definition contradicts other things you believe. Either you must give up your definition of justice, or you must give up those other beliefs. Usually, people couldn't do either comfortably, leaving them puzzled and annoyed. Was Socrates being sincere when he claimed ignorance? That's debated. Sometimes he seems genuinely perplexed, unable to find satisfactory answers to his own questions. Other times, his questions seem designed to lead his conversation partner to a predetermined conclusion. The elenchus might be both a genuine search for truth and a teaching tool that forces people to think more carefully. What's clear is that Socrates believed most people live in a state of false confidence. They think they know things they don't actually know. They've never examined their assumptions or tested their beliefs against counterexamples. They accept conventional wisdom without question. This unexamined life, Socrates insisted, is not worth living. The first step toward wisdom is recognizing your own ignorance. This sounds humble, but it had radical implications. If the generals don't really know what courage is, if the priests don't really know what piety is, if the politicians don't really know what justice is, then their authority is undermined. Why should we follow leaders who don't understand the principles they claim to embody? Why should we accept traditional values if no one can coherently explain or defend them? Socrates seemed to be doing what the sophists did, questioning everything, showing that conventional beliefs don't withstand scrutiny. But his goal was opposite. The sophists concluded that since we can't find objective truth, we should focus on persuasion and success. Socrates concluded that since we haven't yet found objective truth, we must keep searching more carefully. The sophists taught rhetoric. Socrates practiced dialectic, the art of reaching truth through question and answer, through exposing and resolving contradictions. He also differed from the sophists in his lifestyle. They charged high fees and lived comfortably. Socrates took no payment and lived in poverty. They travelled widely. He rarely left Athens except for military service. They dressed well and cultivated their public image. He went around in rags and seemed indifferent to appearances. They promised to make their students successful. Socrates promised nothing except the difficult work of self-examination. Most importantly, Socrates believed that virtue and knowledge are connected in a way the sophists denied. If you truly know what's good, he argued, you'll do it. Vice comes from ignorance. No one knowingly does wrong. When people act badly, it's because they're confused about what's genuinely good for them. The thief thinks stealing will make him happy, but he's wrong. He doesn't understand that injustice harms the soul. If he truly understood this, he wouldn't steal. This sounds absurdly optimistic. Don't people often know what's right but do wrong anyway? Socrates denied it. Apparent counterexamples involve people who have partial knowledge or false beliefs mixed with true ones. They know that stealing is conventionally wrong, but they don't really understand why or how it damages them. If they had complete knowledge, complete understanding, they'd act virtuously, not from fear of punishment, but because they'd recognize that virtue is its own reward, that a just soul is a healthy soul. This theory of moral knowledge would become central to Western ethics, but in Athens, it made Socrates dangerous. He wasn't just questioning definitions. He was challenging the entire basis of Athenian society. The city operated on the assumption that ordinary citizens, through experience and traditional wisdom, could make good decisions about justice, courage, and virtue. Democratic institutions depended on this. Jurors decided cases, assembly members voted on policies, all without claiming expertise. They relied on common sense and shared values. Socrates suggested this wasn't enough. That common sense was often confused, that shared values were often incoherent, that people needed philosophical training to understand what they were doing. This didn't sit well in a democracy that prided itself on the wisdom of ordinary citizens. His method attracted followers, especially among the young. Wealthy aristocratic youth found it thrilling to watch Socrates dismantle the pretensions of their elders. Here was entertainment and education combined. They'd gather around him in the agora or the gymnasium, listening as he questioned some pompous general or self-important politician. They'd laugh when the victim got tangled in contradictions. Some started imitating his technique, going around Athens asking annoying questions of their own. Their fathers were not amused. From their perspective, Socrates was corrupting the youth, teaching them disrespect for authority and traditional values. He was making young men question everything their parents had taught them. He was turning them into sophists, or worse, the political situation made this dangerous. Athens was losing the Peloponnesian War. The democracy was under strain. People were looking for scapegoats, for explanations of why things were going wrong. Some of Socrates' former associates hadn't helped his reputation. Alcibiades had been one of his closest companions. Brilliant, beautiful, and utterly without scruples, Alcibiades had led Athens into the disastrous Sicilian expedition, then defected to Sparta when things went badly. He'd advised Athens' enemies, betrayed his city, and eventually been assassinated. But everyone remembered he'd been Socrates' friend. Critias was even worse. Another former associate of Socrates, he'd become one of the 30 tyrants who'd briefly overthrown Athenian democracy in 404 BC. During their 8-month reign of terror, the 30 murdered perhaps 1,500 citizens and exiled thousands more. Critias was among the most brutal. When democracy was restored, he was killed in battle, but the association with Socrates lingered. This wasn't fair. Socrates hadn't taught Alcibiades to betray Athens or Critias to murder his fellow citizens. He taught them to think, to question, to examine their assumptions. What they did with that training was their choice, but the connection was there, and Athens noticed. The restored democracy declared an amnesty forbidding prosecution for actions during the oligarchy. You couldn't charge someone for what they'd done under the 30, but you could charge them for corrupting the youth who'd become tyrants. You could charge them for impiety, for not believing in the gods the city believed in. In 399 BC, 3 men brought charges against Socrates: Meletus, a poet of no particular distinction; Anytus, a democratic politician and successful tanner; Lycon, a rhetorician. The charges were vague but deadly, corrupting the youth and impiety toward the gods of Athens. The trial took place before a jury of 501 citizens, chosen by lot as Athenian juries were. It lasted a single day. The accusers spoke first, presenting their case. Then Socrates defended himself. He could have won. The vote was close. 280 to 220. A shift of just 31 votes would have acquitted him. And Socrates had options. He could have appealed to emotion, brought his wife and children forward to plead for mercy. Athenian juries were notoriously susceptible to this. He could have promised to stop philosophizing, to retire from public life. He could have proposed exile as an alternative punishment. Instead, he gave a defense that seemed calculated to offend. He denied corrupting anyone. He said his philosophical activity was service to the god Apollo. that he'd been commanded by divine signs to question his fellow citizens. Far from deserving punishment, he deserved to be maintained at public expense in the Prytaneum, the honour Athens gave to Olympic victors and great benefactors. He was Athens' greatest blessing, he said, even if the city didn't recognise it. The jury voted again on the penalty. This time the margin was wider. More jurors voted for death after hearing Socrates' arrogance than had voted for guilt in the first place. He was sentenced to drink hemlock, the standard Athenian method of execution. But the execution couldn't happen immediately. A religious festival was underway, and no executions were permitted until it ended. Socrates spent a month in prison. His friends came to visit. They hatched a plan to help him escape. Crito, one of his oldest companions, arranged everything. Guards would be bribed, a ship would be ready. Safe refuge awaited in Thessaly. Socrates refused. In one of Plato's most famous dialogues, the Crito, Socrates explains why. He'd lived his entire life under Athenian law. He'd benefited from its protection, raised his children under its system, accepted its verdicts when they favoured him. To disobey now, simply because the verdict went against him, would be to act on the principle that laws only matter when they serve your interests. That would make him no better than the sophists he'd criticised. It would undermine everything he'd taught about justice and virtue. The law is greater than any individual. If you think a law is unjust, you can try to persuade the city to change it, but you don't simply break it because it's inconvenient. That way lies chaos. Socrates would rather die than betray his principles. His friends wept. Socrates remained calm. On his final day, as recorded in Plato's Phaedo, he spent his time discussing philosophy. The topic was immortality. Is the soul eternal? Does it survive the body's death? Can we hope for existence beyond this life? He offered several arguments, speaking with the same cool rationality he'd always shown. His companions were devastated. He was serene. When the jailer brought the cup of hemlock, Socrates asked if he could pour a libation to the gods. The jailer said there was only enough poison for the required dose. Socrates smiled, said a brief prayer, and drank it down. He walked around until his legs grew heavy, then lay down. The poison worked upward from his feet. He remained conscious, still talking until near the end. His last words were strange. He said, "Crito, we owe a cock to Asclepius. Pay the debt and don't neglect it." Asclepius was the god of healing. Sacrificing a cock was the standard offering after recovering from illness. Was Socrates suggesting that death was a cure, a release from the sickness of life? Was he being ironic? Was he simply thinking of some minor obligation? No one knows. Then he died. It was 399 BC. He was 70 years old. He'd spent his life questioning everything and everyone. He'd claimed to know nothing except his own ignorance. He'd refused money, comfort, and conventional success. He'd made enemies of powerful people and annoyed almost everyone he encountered, and he'd changed philosophy forever. Before Socrates, philosophy in Greece was primarily concerned with nature. What is the world made of? How did it come to be? What are the fundamental elements? These are important questions, but they're not the ones most people actually struggle with. Socrates shifted philosophy's focus to human concerns. How should we live? What is justice? What is courage? What makes a life worth living? These questions are harder than physics. You can measure the material world, run experiments, gather data. You can't do that with virtue. You can't weigh justice or measure courage with instruments. You need a different method, one based on careful reasoning, an honest examination of your beliefs. Socrates provided that method. He also established something crucial: the philosopher as social critic, someone whose job is to question authority, challenge assumptions, make people uncomfortable. This is dangerous work. Athens killed Socrates for it. But every society needs people willing to do it. Without them, bad ideas go unchallenged. Comfortable lies replace difficult truths. Conventional wisdom hardens into unquestionable dogma. The gadfly stings the lazy horse. The philosopher disturbs the sleeping city. It's annoying, it's necessary. Socrates proved both. His death created his legend. If he'd died peacefully in bed at 90, he'd be remembered as an eccentric who asked odd questions. But Athens killed him, and suddenly everything changed. The city that claimed to be the birthplace of philosophy, the most enlightened place in Greece, had murdered its wisest citizen. The democracy that prided itself on freedom of speech had silenced the one voice most worth hearing. This wasn't lost on his followers. Plato was 28 when Socrates died. The trial and execution shattered his faith in Athenian democracy. How could a system that claims to be just kill the most just man in the city? How could a government based on popular wisdom make such a catastrophically wrong decision? These questions would haunt Plato for the rest of his life and drive him to create his own philosophical vision. Other students scattered. Some wrote defences of Socrates. Some composed dialogues featuring him as the main character, preserving his method and ideas. A whole genre emerged called Socratic dialogues, philosophical conversations modelled on his technique. Most are lost, but Plato survived, and through them Socrates became immortal. We don't have direct access to the historical Socrates. He wrote nothing. Everything we know comes through others, primarily Plato. This creates a problem. Where does Socrates end and Plato begin? The early dialogues probably represent Socrates fairly accurately, showing him asking questions and reaching no definite conclusions. Later dialogues put increasingly complex theories in Socrates' mouth, theories that almost certainly originated with Plato. By the end, Socrates is a character, a literary device Plato uses to express his own philosophy. Scholars call this the Socratic problem. We can't separate the historical figure from the legend, but maybe that's appropriate. Socrates believed that knowledge comes through dialogue, through one mind challenging another. He lives on in the conversations Plato recorded, even if those conversations are partly fictional. The method survives even if the man doesn't. That method remains powerful. Take any belief you hold strongly. Now ask, why do I believe this? Can I define the key terms clearly? Are there counterexamples I'm ignoring? What assumptions am I making? If everyone believed this, would that be good? Does this belief survive honest scrutiny, or only work when I don't examine it too closely? Most beliefs don't survive this process. They crumble under questioning. That's uncomfortable. It's also liberating. Better to discover your beliefs are confused now than to base your life on them and fail. Better to admit ignorance than to pretend knowledge you don't have. Socrates showed that wisdom begins with recognizing how little you know. That virtue requires understanding, not just good intentions. That the unexamined life genuinely isn't worth living. These aren't just philosophical abstractions. They're practical guides for anyone trying to think clearly and live well. Athens killed him for asking questions. He could have stopped asking. He could have compromised, gone along, kept his head down. He chose death instead. That choice defines him. Some truths matter more than survival. Some principles are worth dying for. The examined life, lived with integrity, is worth more than a long, comfortable existence built on lies. Socrates died. Philosophy lived. The questions he asked are still unanswered. We still don't have perfect definitions of justice, courage, or virtue. We still struggle to live according to principles we can't quite articulate. We still rely on conventional wisdom we haven't examined. His challenge remains. Will we accept easy answers or do the difficult work of thinking clearly? Will we examine our lives or sleepwalk through them? The hemlock didn't silence Socrates. It made him eternal. Plato left Athens immediately after the execution. He was 28 years old, devastated, and suddenly aware that association with Socrates could be dangerous. The restored democracy was nervous. Anyone too closely connected to the man they'd just killed might face questions. Plato fled to Megara, a small city-state about 25 miles west, where Euclides, another Socratic student, offered refuge. He stayed several months. The small community of Socrates' followers gathered there, talking, grieving, trying to make sense of what had happened. They'd lost their teacher. More than that, they'd witnessed proof that the city could destroy wisdom itself. But Megara was temporary. Plato was restless. The question that Socrates' death had planted in his mind demanded answers he couldn't find in Greece. If Athens, the greatest democracy in the world, could execute its wisest citizen, then something was fundamentally wrong with how cities operated. Understanding that required going beyond what Athens could teach him. So Plato travelled. For the next 12 years, roughly from 399 to 387 BC, he wandered the Mediterranean world. The exact itinerary is unclear. Ancient biographers offer contradictory accounts, and Plato himself rarely mentioned these journeys in his writings. But the general pattern is known. He went to Egypt. Greek intellectuals had long believed that Egypt held ancient wisdom, that the priests of Memphis and Heliopolis preserved knowledge reaching back thousands of years. Whether Plato actually gained much from Egyptian sources is debatable. The priests were secretive. The language barrier was significant. But the experience of encountering a civilization far older than Greece with different values and different gods expanded his sense of what human society could be. He travelled to Cyrene on the North African coast, where he studied mathematics with Theodorus, a geometer working on problems involving irrational numbers. Mathematics was becoming increasingly important to Plato's thinking. Unlike the messy compromises of politics or the ambiguities of moral judgment, mathematics offered certainty. A geometric proof was true everywhere and forever. That kind of eternal truth appealed to someone haunted by Athens' terrible mistake. Most importantly, he went to southern Italy, to the Greek colonies there, and encountered the Pythagoreans. This changed everything. Pythagoras had lived a century earlier, establishing communities devoted to philosophy, mathematics, and a peculiar religious discipline. His followers believed that reality was fundamentally mathematical. The harmony of music could be expressed in numerical ratios. The movements of the planets followed mathematical patterns. Perhaps everything, including justice and virtue, had an underlying mathematical structure. They also believed in the immortality of the soul and its transmigration through multiple lives. The body was a prison. The soul, divine and eternal, was temporarily trapped in flesh. Through philosophical discipline and moral purification, one could free the soul from the cycle of rebirth. In Tarentum, Plato met Archytas, a Pythagorean philosopher who was also a mathematician, a scientist, and a successful political leader. Here was someone who combined intellectual excellence with practical governance. Archytas wasn't just theorizing about the ideal state, he was actually running one and doing it well. The Pythagorean influence on Plato was profound. The idea that an invisible realm of eternal mathematical truths exists behind the visible world of changing things. The belief that the soul is immortal and distinct from the body. The conviction that philosophy is a way of purifying the soul. All of this came from Pythagoreanism and would shape everything Plato later wrote. But it was in Sicily that Plato's travels took their most dramatic turn. Syracuse was the richest and most powerful Greek city in the western Mediterranean. It was ruled by Dionysius the Elder, a tyrant in the Greek sense, someone who had seized power by force and held it through military strength. Dionysius was cultured enough to want famous intellectuals at his court, but brutal enough to make visitors nervous. Plato arrived around 388 BC. He was 40 years old, increasingly famous as a follower of Socrates and an emerging philosopher in his own right. What happened next became legendary, though the details are disputed. Plato met Dion, the tyrant's brother-in-law. Dion was young, intelligent, and hungry for something more meaningful than the cynical power politics of Syracuse. When he heard Plato lecture on philosophy, on virtue, on the possibility of living justly, something ignited in him. He became Plato's devoted student. Plato, for his part, began to imagine possibilities. What if a ruler could be educated in philosophy? What if power and wisdom could be united? Dionysius himself was probably beyond saving, too old, too set in his ways. But what if the next generation could be different? This hope would lead to disaster, but not yet. First came a different catastrophe. Plato's philosophical lectures apparently irritated Dionysius. Maybe the tyrant didn't appreciate someone implicitly criticizing how he ruled. Maybe Plato was too blunt. Maybe the whole situation was simply impossible from the start. A philosopher and a tyrant were natural enemies. Dionysius arranged for Plato to leave Syracuse, but not safely. The philosopher was handed over to a Spartan ambassador who sold him into slavery on the island of Aegina. Plato, the aristocratic Athenian, the student of Socrates, the emerging intellectual star, suddenly became property. Slavery in the ancient world meant complete loss of freedom. A slave could be worked to death, beaten, used however the owner wished. Plato was extremely lucky. A man named Anacharis from Cyrene recognized him in the slave market and purchased his freedom. Some accounts say Anacharis was a philosopher who knew Plato's reputation. Others say friends in Athens sent money to buy him back. Either way, Plato escaped. He returned to Athens in 387 BC, 13 years after fleeing. He was 40 years old. He'd seen much of the Mediterranean world. He'd studied with mathematicians and Pythagoreans. He'd witnessed tyranny up close. He'd been enslaved and freed. The experiences had transformed him from a shocked young man fleeing Socrates' execution into someone ready to build something permanent. Philosophy needed an institution. Socrates had taught informally, gathering students wherever he went. When he died, the teaching died with him. Plato wanted something that would outlast any individual. He wanted a school. Just outside Athens' walls, about a mile northwest of the city, lay a grove of trees sacred to the hero Academus. The land was called the Academy. Plato purchased property there and established what would become the world's first university. It opened around 387 BC and would operate continuously for over 900 years until the Christian emperor Justinian closed it in 529 AD. No other educational institution in human history has lasted as long. The Academy wasn't a university in the modern sense. There were no formal degrees, no fixed curriculum, no lecture halls. It was more like a permanent research community. Students came to study with Plato and the other philosophers who gathered there. They lived nearby, attended lectures and discussions, and worked on problems in mathematics, astronomy, and philosophy. Mathematics was the foundation. According to tradition, an inscription over the entrance read, "Let no one ignorant of geometry enter here." Whether that inscription actually existed is debatable, but it captures the spirit. Plato believed mathematics trained the mind to think about eternal truths, preparing students for philosophy. The Academy attracted brilliant students from across the Greek world. Some stayed for years, some became philosophers in their own right. The most famous would arrive in 367 BC, a 17-year-old from Macedonia named Aristotle, who would study with Plato for 20 years before developing his own philosophical system. But Plato wasn't content merely to teach. He had questions that needed answering. The biggest question, the one that had haunted him since Socrates' death, demanded a comprehensive response. What is justice? If Athens could kill its wisest citizen and call that lawful, what did justice even mean? The answer required examining everything: the nature of the soul, the structure of society, the education of citizens, the role of philosophers, the meaning of the good. It required nothing less than designing an ideal city from scratch. He began writing. The dialogue would be called The Republic, and it would become his most famous work. The project took years. The final version runs to several hundred pages, making it by far Plato's longest dialogue. It's written as a conversation that Socrates had years earlier, recounted the next day. The device allows Plato to put his own developed philosophical system into Socrates' mouth while maintaining the conversational format his teacher had pioneered. The Republic begins with a simple question: is justice profitable? Is it better to be a just person who appears unjust or an unjust person who appears just? To answer, Socrates proposes examining justice writ large, in an entire city rather than an individual soul. If we can understand what makes a city just, we might understand what makes a person just. So they construct a city in speech, building it up piece by piece. First comes economic organization. A city needs farmers, builders, weavers, people to produce the necessities of life. But it also needs defenders, warriors to protect against external threats. These guardians require special education, training both their bodies and their souls. Here Plato makes his first radical proposal. The guardians must be educated in music and gymnastics, but not the music and gymnastics of contemporary Athens. Poetry must be censored. Homer and Hesiod, the foundational texts of Greek culture, must be edited or banned because they show gods behaving badly. If guardians believe the gods lie and cheat, they'll think lying and cheating are divine. The guardians divide into two classes: auxiliaries who defend the city and rulers who govern it. These rulers, the guardians proper, must be philosophers. Only those who understand truth, who have studied mathematics and dialectic, who have grasped the form of the good itself, are fit to rule. And here comes the most shocking proposal. These philosopher rulers must have no private property. They own nothing individually. They live communally, fed by the state. Even more radically, they have no private families. Children are raised collectively. Parents don't know which children are theirs. Children don't know their parents. This prevents nepotism and ensures rulers care about the city as a whole, rather than their own bloodlines. Women can be guardians too. If a woman has the intelligence and courage required, she should receive the same education as men and serve in the same roles. This was almost unthinkable in 5th century Athens, where women were largely confined to the household. The city has three classes: producers who make things, auxiliaries who defend, and guardians who rule. Justice is each class doing its proper work without interfering with the others. The producers produce, the auxiliaries protect, the guardians govern. When everyone does their job, the city is just. Now the argument turns back to the individual. The soul has three parts corresponding to the city's three classes. Appetite seeks pleasure and satisfaction. It's the desiring part. Spirit seeks honor and feels anger. It's the emotional part. Reason understands and judges. It's the rational part. A just soul is one where reason rules, spirit supports reason, and appetite obeys. The parallel is exact. But who are these philosopher rulers, and why should they rule? Plato's answer requires understanding his theory of forms, the doctrine that would define his philosophy and influence Western thought for 2 millennia. The forms exist in a realm beyond the physical world, eternal and unchanging. Everything we see around us, this tree, that horse, this beautiful face, is merely a copy of a perfect original that exists in the realm of forms. The tree we see is imperfect, temporary, destined to decay. But the form of tree is perfect, eternal, never changing. This is true of concepts as well. We call many things just, but what makes them just? They all participate in the form of justice itself, which exists independently of any just action or just person. The physical world is one of constant flux. Everything changes, decays, comes into being and passes away. But the forms are stable, knowable, real, in a way that physical things are not. Most people live their entire lives seeing only shadows. This is the meaning of the cave allegory, perhaps the most famous passage in the Republic. Imagine prisoners chained in a cave since childhood, facing a wall. Behind them burns a fire, and between the fire and the prisoners, people carry objects. The prisoners see only shadows cast on the wall. These shadows are their reality. One prisoner is freed. He turns and sees the fire, the objects, the people carrying them. It's painful. The light hurts his eyes. He's dragged out of the cave into the sunlight. At first he's blinded, but gradually his eyes adjust. He sees trees, sky, eventually the sun itself. He realizes everything in the cave was an illusion. This freed prisoner is the philosopher. Most people see only the physical world, the realm of shadows and copies. The philosopher, through education, escapes to see the forms themselves. The sun represents the form of the good, the highest form, which illuminates all others just as the sun illuminates visible things. But the philosopher cannot stay in the light. Justice requires him to return to the cave, to the world of human affairs, to rule. He descends reluctantly, out of duty not desire. He would prefer to remain in contemplation of truth, but the city needs his wisdom. This is why philosophers must be forced to rule. They're the only ones who don't want power for its own sake. The Republic ends with the myth of Ea, a story about the afterlife. Ea, a soldier, dies in battle and returns to report what he saw. Souls are judged after death. The just are rewarded, the unjust punished. Then souls choose their next lives. Most choose foolishly, seduced by power or pleasure. Odysseus, wisest of all, chooses last. He picks the life of a private man, having learned that obscurity is better than fame, if fame comes with suffering. The soul is immortal. How we live matters eternally. This is Plato's vision of justice, and it's deeply controversial. Is it a sincere blueprint for society, or a warning about what perfection would require? The abolition of family, the censorship of poetry, the rule by philosophical elite, these ideas have inspired utopians and horrified lovers of freedom for centuries. Plato himself may have known the Republic was impossible. Late in his life, he wrote the Laws, describing a second-best city with more realistic institutions. Perhaps the perfect city exists only in speech as a standard against which to measure actual cities. But the core ideas endure. The distinction between appearance and reality. The notion that true knowledge requires understanding eternal truths. The insistence that justice means each part doing its proper work. These concepts shaped Western philosophy, yet Plato's influence extends far beyond the Republic. His theory of forms became the foundation for centuries of metaphysical debate. Are universals real, or merely names we give to similar things? Do mathematical objects exist independently of human minds? These questions trace back to Plato. His view of the soul influenced Christian theology. Augustine saw the forms as thoughts in the mind of God. Medieval philosophers merged Platonic and Christian ideas into a synthesis that dominated European thought for 1,000 years. His political philosophy shaped debates about the best form of government. Should experts rule or the people? Is democracy mob rule or the truest expression of human dignity? Every modern political argument echoes these Platonic questions. His aesthetics influenced who? Do we think about beauty? Is beauty objective or subjective? Does art reveal truth or merely provide pleasure? The answers we give today still reference Plato's framework. His educational philosophy, that learning is drawing out what the soul already knows, continues to inspire teachers. The Socratic method, asking questions rather than lecturing, remains a powerful pedagogical tool. Plato's academy operated for nearly 900 years until the Emperor Justinian closed it in 529 AD. It was the world's first university, and it established the model for all institutions of higher learning that followed. For a man who died 23 centuries ago, Plato's presence remains startling. Open any philosophy textbook, turn to any chapter on knowledge, reality, morality, beauty, politics, Plato is there. Not as a historical curiosity, but as a living interlocutor, someone whose arguments still demand response. Alfred North Whitehead famously remarked that all of Western philosophy is merely footnotes to Plato. The claim is exaggerated but contains truth. Whether we accept or reject Plato's answers, we're still wrestling with his questions. What is real beyond appearances? What makes an action right? How should society be organized? What is the good life? These questions defined philosophy because Plato asked them with unmatched clarity and force. Consider how his ideas saturate our world. When he speak of Platonic love, we invoke his theory that love begins with physical attraction but should ascend to appreciation of beauty itself. When we call something an ideal, we're using Platonic language, the idea that perfect standards exist against which imperfect instances are measured. When scientists search for mathematical laws underlying physical phenomena, they're working within a broadly Platonic framework, the conviction that reality has a rational structure accessible to human minds. When human rights advocates insist on the inherent dignity of every person, they're echoing Plato's insight, filtered through Christianity, that something eternal and valuable exists within each human being. The dialogue form Plato invented remains powerful. Philosophy presented not as dogma, but as conversation, where ideas emerge through dialectical exchange, where we see smart people thinking through problems together. This model still shapes how we teach and learn. But Plato also bequeathed dangerous ideas. The notion that philosopher kings should rule has justified authoritarian regimes claiming to govern in the name of superior knowledge. The dismissal of democracy as mob rule has comforted dictators and oligarchs. The devaluation of the physical world in favour of an eternal realm has been blamed for otherworldliness, for cultures that neglect material conditions in pursuit of spiritual perfection. Karl Popper, writing after the Second World War, attacked Plato as an enemy of open society, someone whose political philosophy contained the seeds of totalitarianism. The debate continues. Plato's legacy is complex, contested, impossible to summarize simply. He was both rationalist and mystic, political theorist and poet, systematic philosopher and literary artist. He created a body of work so rich that every generation finds new meanings in it. What remains undeniable is the magnitude of his influence. Along with his student Aristotle, Plato defined what philosophy would be. Before Socrates and Plato, Greek thinkers investigated nature, speculated about the cosmos, offered wisdom about how to live. After Plato, philosophy became a systematic discipline with its own methods, its own questions, its own standards of argument. The Western intellectual tradition is unthinkable without him. Remove Plato from history, and you remove not just one thinker, but the entire framework within which European philosophy developed. That one man, writing in Athens 2.5 millennia ago, could cast so long a shadow still astonishes. He had no laboratories, no research grants, no institutional support. He had a grove of trees, some students, and the leisure to think. From this he built something that outlasted empires. The academy closed, Athens declined, the Roman Empire rose and fell, the Dark Ages came and went. The Renaissance recovered ancient learning, the Enlightenment challenged religious authority, the modern world emerged, and through it all Plato remained. His books survived, his questions persisted, his influence grew. Today, in universities across the world, students still read the Republic, still puzzle over the forms, still debate whether the cave allegory reveals truth or merely beautiful metaphor. Plato would have appreciated this. He believed philosophy was not about memorizing doctrines, but about learning to think. The dialogues don't give final answers. They model the process of inquiry. They show us minds at work, wrestling with the hardest questions human beings can ask. That process never ends. Each generation must undertake it anew. We cannot simply accept Plato's conclusions. We must do what he did: question, examine, follow the argument wherever it leads. This is the true legacy, not the specific answers about forms or philosopher kings, but the commitment to rational inquiry, the refusal to accept easy answers, the courage to question everything, including our most cherished beliefs. Socrates died for asking questions. Plato spent 50 years ensuring those questions would never die. He succeeded beyond what any reasonable person could have hoped. The boy who watched his teacher drink hemlock became the man who made that teacher immortal. The dialogues preserve not just Socrates' method, but his spirit, the insistence that the unexamined life is not worth living, that virtue is knowledge, that we must always be seeking wisdom, even knowing we'll never fully possess it.